Hello everybody, good afternoon. My name is Stefania Tutino, and on behalf of the UCLA Alan D. Leave Center for Jewish Studies, I'd like to welcome you today to today's talk. Today we welcome Federica Francesconi to speak on her recent research. I will say a little bit more about her in a minute, but this is just to remind you that this program is made possible by the Viterbi Program in Mediterranean Jewish Studies series. We hope that you can join us at many more Levi Center events this year. You can find more information on these other upcoming events at the registration table near the end of the room. I'm also instructed to tell you to please take a moment to silence your phones before the presentation begins. So, like I said, today we welcome Professor Francesconi, who is Associate Professor of History and Director of the Judaic Studies Program at the University of Albany, SUNY. Her research and publications focus on the social, religious, and cultural dimensions of early modern Jewish life in Italy, with particular attention to the politics and dynamics of the ghetto. She has held fellowships in Europe, Israel, and the United States. Her recent book, Invisible Enlighteners, The Jewish Merchants of Modena from the Renaissance to the Emancipation, which was published by the University of Pennsylvania Press in 2021, won the 2022 Ellen and Howard R. Marraro Prize from the American Historical Association and was the finalist for the 2021 National Jewish Book Awards JDC Herbert Katsky Award for writing based on archival material. And all of these accolades still don't give justice to just how wonderful this book is. It's deeply researched, incredibly innovative, and just a pleasure to read. She's currently working on a new monograph, The Jewish Home in Early Modern Venice, Cosmopolitan Intimacy, Global Networks, and Diasporic Material Culture, which examines the Jewish home in 16th and 17th century Venice as a multi-religious and multi-ethnic nexus of individuals, communities, and objects in motion. This project has been supported by the Gladys Krible Delmas Foundation, the Memorial Foundation for Jewish Culture, and ITATTI, the Harvard University Center for Renaissance Studies in Florence. We are very, very grateful that Professor Francesconi is taking time out of her busy schedule in the middle of her semester to come to us and talk. The title of her paper today is Webs of Life, Domestic Jewish Worlds in Early Modern Venice. Please welcome Professor Federica Francesconi.
Thank you, Stefania. Thank you for your wonderful introduction. It's such an honor to be introduced by a scholar I admire the most. And it's such a pleasure to be here. I had the honor to be the Viterbi postdoc visiting professor 15 years ago at the end of my PhD, and was wonderful. It's a wonderful experience that also changed my academic life. So I'm really grateful to the Viterbi family, and I'm also very grateful to Alan Levy Center for Jewish Studies, also made possible my presence here today. I also want to acknowledge and thank old friends and new friends, Vivian Olenbeck, David Wu, Chelsea White, and William Schindling, the director of Levy Center, for inviting me, and thank you all for being here. I'm going to present today on some parts of my project, and it's a work in progress, so I will be very grateful to have all your feedback. Let me take you to Venice, that for me is now the center of the world. And here you see a map from Ludovico Ughi at the beginning of the 18th century, imposed on a map of the city and the lagoon nowadays, and here I light the area of the ghetto with the synagogues, and here a view of the Ghetto Nuovo. Let me start. On February 15, 1669, Letizia Namias, an Italo-Sephardi woman, died in the Venetian ghetto, leaving her small apartment to the local Spanish Jewish community. Here the apartment was in the Ghetto Vecchio. Just a month earlier, in July 1668, she had dictated her testament in Italian to a trustworthy person and submitted it to a Venetian notary. Letizia was the daughter of Joseph Namias and the former wife of her cousin Samuel Namias, better known after his conversion as the Christian author Giulio Morosini. De la Mia's family, affluent merchants and former New Christians, had fled Castile, returned to Judaism in Albania, prospered in Salonika, and eventually settled in Venice under the leadership of Letizia and Samuel's grandfather, Isaac. In Venice, they sustain an extensive mercantile network across the Adriatic. Over the previous 2 decades, Letizia had fought to secure her apartment, part of her dowry that she donated to the Spanish synagogue after her husband's conversion in 1649. Her brother-in-law Joseph followed Samuel Morosini. Later, her son David was taken to the church by Morosini after Letizia's father Joseph attempted to hide him, and then the child died prematurely. The apartment, located on the 3rd floor of a building in Ghetto Vecchio, the second enclave added in 1542 to accommodate Iberian Jews, had been her lifelong home. Despite becoming estranged from her father, whom she resisted giving control over her possessions, they remained in close proximity. Joseph and his wife Esther lived in the same building alongside other Iberian, Italian, and Levantine Jews recently settled in Venice. Letizia left one of the most extensive legal records of any Jewish woman in the Venetian archives. Beginning in 1655, she skillfully navigated the Venetian legal system to reclaim successfully her dowry and secure her ownership of her apartment, which she converted into a communal trust, explicitly barring any relatives from altering, renting, or claiming it. Yet Letizia was and remained an aguna, a chain woman, who could not remarry without the get, the Jewish divorce, that Morosini refused to give her. Afflicted and betrayed by those closest to her, it seems that her home encapsulated Letizia's whole spiritual, affective, and material existence. In her own word, here, the beginning of her testament, in her own word, she said, I leave the house to the Kaal of the Talmud Torah of the Spaniards of the city to pay the rent of the synagogue. And then she also asked them to dedicate her an ashkava, a memorial prayer typical for Italian and Sephardic Jews. And also the condition was that the apartment cannot be a sell, pawn it, alienate, rent it. It needs to be used for the rent of the synagogue. And also it cannot be land assigned or in any case have any connection to her father, her brothers, and her family in general. Letizia's bequest spoke to her desire to transform the space itself from a personal home to a trust, but her apartment was much more than simply a dwelling. The past and memories of a partial lost wealth were preserved in Venetian architectural elements such as a trifora, a three-light window in iron, a collection of gilded and light blue cuori d'oro, who are portable, leather panels that actually you can really easily bring with you at least during the 16th and 17th century, and a gilded wood lettiera, a large bedstead with 2 lions, and here you see an image that gives you the idea of what this bed was. And these were basically the most popular form of furniture in the Italian Renaissance. None of these objects were left to family members, and here you also have a sense of what an apartment in the ghetto was. So Sephardic origins, diasporic memory, and Renaissance culture, along with Venetian architecture and their attachment to her home, all commingle in Letizia's testament and possession. Previous studies have shed light on the creation and the structure of the ghetto, the commercial networks of Sephardic Jews, and the intellectual history of Jewish scholars, philosophers, and physicians in Venice. My project is at the intersection of social history and material culture, and it explores the Jewish home in Venice during the 16th and 17th century as multi-religious and multi-ethnic webwork of individuals, communities, and objects in motion. Unlike many domestic spaces in this era, the Jewish home in Venice connected outwards to the Mediterranean world and beyond, including Istanbul, Kashan, Corfu, Thessaloniki, Jerusalem, Cairo, Fez, Tunis, and Skopje and Constantine. My project uncovers an unexplored nexus of early modern Italian and Jewish culture, Jewish, Christian, and Muslim encounters, and the global Renaissance. As her apartment shows, the Jewish home in 16th and 17th century Venice was a space that opened onto an extensive social and cultural network of Jewish refugees of Sephardi origins who had been displaced after the medieval Iberian Jewish expulsion, as well as Italian and Ashkenazi Jews resident in the city ghetto since its foundation in 1516. When Spanish and Portuguese Jewish and converso merchants settled in Venice, they joined a ghetto-ready home to Italian and Ashkenazi Jews, who were deeply integrated into Italian culture and saw Judaism as a way of life. In contrast, converso communities had a more fluid religious identity. In Venice, Sephardi Jews and conversos amalgamated into this stream of Judaism. They did not need to build a Jewish theological system from scratch, as subsequently happened in Amsterdam. The Venetian community was not created suddenly or in a vacuum, but was rather the product of the Jewish presence in the Italian peninsula over several centuries through complex negotiations with local authorities and the church. Moreover, even if the Ponentines, literally Western Jews or Iberian Jews, and Levantines, mainly from the Ottoman Empire, modeled their institution on those organized by the Italians and the Ashkenazim, each community sustained independent synagogues and confraternities by maintaining different customs. Additionally, beyond the physical confinement of the ghetto, legal restriction further limited interaction between Jews and Gentiles in daily life. Only within the home were boundaries porous. The ghetto itself was and remained a space of physical segregation, oppression, and housing scarcity. Yet the Jewish home also acted as a crossroad for individuals of various backgrounds. And here we see the apartment that we've already seen, here the picture, the same apartment in 2024, here the ghetto Novissimo with some years ago, and here the ghetto Nuovo e Nuovissimo from a picture from 1990. Among these diverse community in the Jewish home were Jews, Catholics, animists, Muslims, Protestant, and Greek Orthodox. They coexisted within this space in various roles, such as male and female householders, workers, apprentices, servants, and individuals who had experienced enslavement, later achieving freedom through manumission. The Jewish home in Venice was not only a site of diverse interaction, but also a hub for global exchanges of objects in silk, leather, wool, porcelain, and glass. This exchange was part of a broader system of interconnections enacted by the 1540s by Iberian and Levantine Jews, along with Muslim and Christian merchants that spanned across Europe, the Islamic world, Africa, India, China, and the Americas. Jewish strattaroli, literally rag dealers, even if restricted to used goods and haberdashery, moved luxury items through the ghetto, becoming quite competitive in the Venetian market. So if we examine these quite famous paintings in all their details, we see how Jews, Muslim, Black Africans, and women, as well as textiles, each had their own place in the history of the city. Here the Jewish merchants, Black African gondoliers, and here from Carpaccio. By contrast, my project also builds also on recent scholarship on early modern domestic space in Italy, which had shown how material culture shaped Christian, social, religious, and intellectual life. And just thinking about Venice, I want to mention the studies by Fortini Brown, Blake, and Palumbo Fossati. In the Venetian ghetto, Jews developed a distinct housing model, apartment buildings organized around central staircases that you see here, unlike the freestanding homes of other Venetians. Within these spatial limits, Jewish families often shared architectural and household practices with non-Jewish neighbors. Many Christian household objects circulated beyond their original owners, accumulating meanings tied less to the biography of the owners and more to the wider material economy of early modern Italy. And often their houses are envisioned as self-contained microcosms. By contrast, the Jewish home in early modern Venice was both an embryonic space and a webwork, to borrow the definition by the anthropologist Tim Ingold, of people, things, and communities in ghetto that traveled together and expanded both vertically and horizontally into the city and its natural surrounding. Despite the silences and gaps often resulting from women's intersectional positions in ghetto society, surviving sources provide unexpected insights into Jewish women's life, like Letizia's, during the early modern age. In the time I have left, I draw on unpublished archival sources in Italian, Hebrew, Latin, Yiddish, Portuguese, Spanish, and Ladino, surviving objects including manuscripts and printed illuminated books, and the built environment, to explore how Jewish matrons shaped their own 17th century ghetto homes. I begin with two key domestic spaces. And now here, let me say that this space usually is a source of anxiety for people who are not totally in love with Venice as I am. So this is the portego that is basically the most important space in a Venetian palazzo, the long hall that typically run from front to back to each piano nobile. Here we are in Cadoro, one of the most important building and homes, originally homes of noblemen in Venice. And here you see this space that basically is that dictates a sort of layout of the piano nobile and the different rooms faced on this portico. And there was a space that was liminal where relatives, clients, and friends were received. So we will see how Jews and in their homes adapted to this culture and this physical space. The other space I want to talk to you is what I call the Jewish widow's room, a space created for widows who could not longer occupy their original apartment and ceded it to their children or other heirs. In both spaces, we see Jews adapting goods, furnishing, and architectural elements to fit very specific cultural and functional needs. Here, in addition to Letizia, I follow two other women whose stories I traced in the archives. Mazal Tov Kamis, an affluent Levantine matron and enaguna, and Rosa Luzzatto, an Italo-Ashkenazi widow fluent in Italian, Hebrew, and Yiddish, who found herself reduced to a single room in which she preserved for decades the portraits of herself and her husband. From there, I turn to the home as a site of cross-culturation. I look at objects like these fuori d'oro panels that I show a few minutes ago, as well, and I will mention also a wood chest, not simply as decorations, but as active participants in cultural exchange. These objects bridge Jewish traditions with Venetian artistic languages, creating richly layered interiors that operated across boundaries. And in this section, I will follow the story of Stella Kamis, an impoverished Levantine widow supported only by her youngest son, Aaron, after the other two sons she had abandoned her. She passed to him her precious fuori d'oro she had preserved in a chest. Finally, I focus on forms of domestic transculturation that emerged when textile, furniture, and repurposed Islamic carpets reflected a broader Mediterranean network merging Jewish, Islamic, and Renaissance aesthetic. The term transculturation was created by the Cuban anthropologist Fernando Ortiz in 1940 as a translation from one culture to another. But it has been expanded into a category that implies the interplay between different cultures, and that is what I follow. And I will refer to Tova Cohen Tamari, who transformed a Muslim prayer carpet from Iran into a parochet, a Torah art curtain dedicated to her father. So let me now go to what was an apartment, a layout of an apartment in the ghetto. And here you see this portego, this hall that has been maintained as the central place for this apartment. In ghetto houses, what happened is that, again, the space was limited and the shape was not always fully rectangular, as the historian of architecture Ennio Concinas has shown. The central role of the portego in Jewish domestic life is evident in this 1601 Sefer Minagim, a book of Jewish custom, in which this illustration is taken, and it represents a circumcision held in this space. The renowned Venetian rabbi Leone Modena, in his Storia dei Riti, published in 1638, noted that Italian Jews held circumcisions either in synagogue or at home, preparing two silk-covered chairs, one for the godfather and one symbolically for the prophet Elijah. Hymns were sung, a crowd gathered, and the godmother handed the child to the godfather at the threshold. While Modena favored synagogue rites, the multifunctional portego in Jewish homes often served as a ceremonial space, blurring boundaries between private and public life. The Sefer Minagim illustration captures the domestic setting. The circumcision takes place in a portego framed by a tree for a window and adorned with wall hangings. Two Savonarola chairs are occupied by the godfather and Elijah. Other figures wear contemporary Venetian dress, and a dwarf evoking Veronese festive scenes bears a tray of circumcision tools as described by Modena, and that is one of the paintings of Veronese that for which the artist of this illustration took inspiration. Jewish homes of the mercantile elite in the Venetian ghetto, we mentioned, were cramped apartments, though modest in size, and at times reflected the elegance of the city's domestic architecture. Letizia Lamia's apartment, described in 1670, when it was rented to merchant Gabriel Valencin, features refined details. A portico with an iron trifora and a mezzanine, bronze-decorated doors, and a kitchen with a marble basin, walnut sideboard, and multiple closets. These features echoed the style of affluent Jewish homes, where light and air entered through windows and ironwork pergolati. Yet, just a year earlier, in 1669, Letizia's household inventory, after her death, compiled by a notary, revealed a stark contrast. Her portico was furnished with damaged walnut Savonarola chairs, like those depicted in the etching we just saw, broken stools, a simple table and a closet, and stramazzo, a mattress filled with wool used by her maidservant Perla to sleep in during the night. The contrast between the two records underscores the precarity of even well-off Jewish households, especially for women facing marital or financial upheaval. And also, of course, looking at sources, you also need to consider in which circumstances the documents are produced. So the contract of rent describe the architecture of the house. The inventory of the apartment, the inventory after Letizia's death describe the furniture in the apartment. let me go to the woman we mentioned already at the beginning, Mazal Tov Khamis. She was the daughter of the late Isaac Khamis and in Aguna with 3 children, separated from her husband Samuel Namias, lived in Ghetto Vecchio. I apologize for in the name of the Venetian Jews, but there is a certain repetition of names. Her apartment nearby the staircases of the Ghetto Bakery consisted of a bedroom with a small room, a portego with a balcony, and a small room annexed with a kitchen. The 3 children must have slept in one or both small rooms. In 1653, the portego, this all, features one large pine armoire, a walnut table with drawers, one stramazzo, a mattress in bad condition, probably used by a servant, as Letizia Furnish also seems to suggest, a regular chair or stool called scanno of walnut. By the way, just a communication, if you want to study Jews in Venice, in addition to Hebrew, Italian, Latin, Ladino, you really need to learn Venetian language, the Venetian dialect. A marble table with decorations painted in fox marble, a walnut writing desk, and a curtain for the balcony. Mazal Tov home was an important asset in her patrimony, giving her unstable family situation. In her 1653 will, Mazal Tov expressed concern for the future of her children. In her own word, I quote, foreseeing the little help and remedy that may come from me from my husband for the sustenance of myself and my 3 little children, Isaac, David, and Simcha, and guessing my days of life to be few, considering my suffering and afflictions, I ask my present testament to be written by a confident person. At the time of her death, in the same year, in 1653, Mazal Tov Khamis owned 3 carved and gilded walnut chests that are the typical object for preserving objects in Venetian homes, and those contained a variety of objects, of which the most frequent were Hebrew books of a non-specified content, that is quite typical in notaries' inventories, not describing the title, including the titles of books, Sidurim, prayer books, Hanukkah and menorah lamps, carpets, linens, towels, and female dress, aprons, skirts, and fur coats. Her Sephardi identity is proven by 6 copies of the Seder Ma'amadot, a compendium of prayers in Hebrew and Ladino for each day of the week, printed in Venice in 1616. The abundance of luxury among her personal possessions parallel the architectural feature and decoration of her apartment and indicate that Mazal Tov was wealthy and created her own place in her small apartment in the Venetian ghetto. Now, the etching that we have examined shows the portego adorned with wall hanging, and Jewish families often decorated these spaces with still lifes, portrait, textiles like arazzi, and gilded leather panels, this corridoro that we already mentioned, and other furniture. A transformation of the Jewish home also occurred through cross-culturation, objects that exhibited a degree of contact, as the history of Letizia Namias corridoro I mentioned at the beginning suggests. These objects were traveling to different places with their owners. The corridoro industry flourished in Venice, growing from a handful of artisans in 1487 to over 70 shops by the mid-16th century. These portable, gilded, and painted leather panels became an hallmark of Venetian interior decor, used in both Christian and Jewish homes. Originally crafted by Iberian Muslims and by Iberian Muslim and Jewish artisans who later expanded their work in North Africa, corridoro production involved imported leathers from Persia and Turkey, processed in Venice, and even re-exported in Constantinople. Among Venetian Jews, corridoro held both decorative and emotional significance. Letizia Namias, and I show you also other examples here. Letizia owned a set of gilded and light blue panels, originally displayed in her portego and bedroom, later stored in the mezzanine at the time of her death. In the 1660s, and now I go to the Stella Camise, the mother was afflicted by her 2 children and who found comfort in the third. So in the 1660s, Isaac and Stella Camise's home in Ghetto Vecchio included a portego with a small annex room, a living room, 2 bedrooms, and a kitchen richly furnished. The Camise were Levantine merchants who established trading activities in Tunis, Livorno, Constantinople, and the Netherlands. Isaac and Stella Camise possessed a remarkable 106 multicolor cuori d'oro panels. By following Isaac's death in 1663, Stella's fortunes declined. Her 1670 inventory lists only a few furnishings and clothes. In her testament, she recounts betrayal by her eldest son Gabriel, who looted the house and moved the valuable to his wife's apartment. Only her youngest child, Aaron, came to help, to comfort, and saved her from living in misery. And she rewarded him with her remaining possessions. And this included the portion she had left of the family's cuori d'oro and the stake in the pawn shop of her family. Her third son, Joseph, also left and was disinherited. Cuori d'oros were not limited to domestic setting. They adorn Sephardic synagogue and the Scuola Spagnola in Venice. Here we see the cuori d'oro coming from the Scuola Spagnola, preserved nowadays in the Jewish Museum in Venice. But they were also present in the Nahon Synagogue in Tetuan and Bevis Marks in London. Their presence illustrates both cultural exchange and personal continuity. As globally traded luxury and portable items, they became agents of cross-culturation between Christian, Jewish, and Muslim worlds. Yet, within Jewish homes in Venice, they also serve as transitional objects, sensory links to lost Iberian and Levantine homelands, helping families like Stella's navigate exile, diasporic memory, and loss. Now, there are some spaces, and now I go to the widow's room. There are some spaces and objects that only archival sources reveal. Matrons who often survived their husband gave, loaned, and transmitted casacode in Judo-Venetian plural for casacca, the judicial institution of perpetual household, and other goods. Consequently, at times widows found themselves impoverished or confined to only one room in their original house, now owned by one of their sons or other male relatives. Rosa Calimani, who died in 1665, daughter of Lipet and Rabbi Abraham, was a learned Ashkenazi Italo-Venetian woman from an illustrious family. Rosa was fluent in Italian, Hebrew, and Yiddish. She married Rabbi Nehemiah Luzzatto, a member of another prominent Italo-Ashkenazi family known for its rabbis, Strazzaroli, and many lenders. Nehemiah was the brother of the renowned Rabbi Simone Luzzatto, author of the influential Discourse on the State of the Jews, published in 1638. Rosa wrote her first will in 1619 in Italian, and signed a second in 1665, in which she noted that she was too ill and weak to write it herself, being bedridden and unable to hold the pen. Remaining widowed and childless in 1619, Rosa had found herself living in one room of her brother-in-law's and then nephew house in the Ghetto Nuovo, and that house was originally her house. She was impoverished by the death of her husband and donation inter vivos to her relatives. The room became her home, and 2 portraits of both herself and her husband Nehemiah were proudly hung. In her own word, here you see that she described what happened to her. She was impoverished with all this donation, but she is very beloved by her great nephew, and she mentioned also that she will leave all by the way, she will leave all her patrimony to Michele, her great nephew, but she mentioned also that in addition to this chest, she had also the 2 portraits. Rosa has lived for 70 years in the same house. She lost her beloved husband in 1619, followed shortly afterward by the death of their niece, Glorietta, whom she had loved as a daughter. Contemplating the 2 portraits each day must have offered Rosa a way to reconnect with a word of affection lost too soon. In Jewish homes, portraits were always on display and in light of available evidence, it appears the Venetian Jews commissioned their portraits more commonly than elsewhere in both contemporary Sephardi and Ashkenazi words. The oil portrait of the merchant Jacob Baruch Caravaggio from late 17th century Venice that you see in the slide is only one example. Then here you see another one from the 16th century, and then Leone Modena, this famous rabbi, set for 3 portraits, one of which was printed in the title page of his Historia of the Jewish Custom, Historia dei Riti, in 1638. Another woman I want to mention that was part of this house, Rosa Luzzatto. Anna Levi's Luzzatto apartment was in the same house where Rosa lived and consisted of a small portico, 1 room, a kitchen, and an altana, a rooftop terrace. She was the wife of Simone, son of this Michele, the great nephew that we just mentioned. Anna remained a widow in 1685. Until her death in 1710, Anna displayed 8 framed portraits, 5 large and 3 small in the small portico, and 2 additional portraits in the bedroom. And the additional portraits in the bedroom was one of herself and the other of her husband. So we can infer that for Anna, these portraits embodied the home's layered memory, spanning from her immediate family to the broader multi-generational household that had found new roots in Venice. She had a lot of portraits of her family members. And also perhaps of note would be the fact that also she put these portraits in the portico that is a liminal space where people are welcome in the apartment. So there is a sort of being more confident in the Jewish identity, moving all the portraits from the bedroom to the portico that I've seen in the archives. Now let me go to my last story. The life of a religious Jewish, Christian, and Muslim object and transculturation. So, in these objects from Jewish, Christian, and Muslim culture were transformed the Jewish home. And not only they did develop in their materiality and meanings, but also they enable some transformation in the domestic context in which they circulated. So let me see here, we have, this is a scene of from the same Sefer Minhagim, the Book of Custom, and you see the welcoming of the Sabbath, of Shabbat, by a Jewish matron, her 2 daughters, and a servant. And so we see various elements of Venetian culture, for example, the fashion, that are important to note. Yet, perhaps, the most common object to be found in Jewish and non-Jewish homes that we find in this image is the carpet covering the table here. 16th and 17th century inventories indicate that Venetian Jewish merchants, such as the affluent Bazaltov Kamis, furnished their homes with these carpets defined tappeti Cagiarini and Turceschi. In Venice, textiles constituted the most evident component of the visual culture of both the city and the home. Carpet shaped the city by decorating interiors of homes and confraternal and religious institutions, as well as facades of patrician and diplomats' houses during religious and festive occasions, as we have seen in the images, in the paintings I show from at the beginning, from Venetian lives. They were originally Muslim prayer rugs and generally purchased in the markets of Syria, Egypt, and the Ottoman Empire, and used to cover such furnishing as tables, chests, and writing desks. So the fact that these were Muslim prayers rugs bring us to my concept of religious objects in the house. In Jewish homes, however, these prayer rug carpets from Cairo, Damascus, and Kashan assume also new function. Repurposed as parochot, Torah art curtains, they regained their prayer function within a Jewish context. This transformation is evident in two 17th century examples. An Ottoman Egyptian Venetian parochet, like used in domestic setting, that we see in the first image, and in Iranian Venetian parochet embroidered in 1601 by the Jewish matron Tova Cohen Tamari. The former is probably from a 17th century manufactory in Ottoman-controlled Egypt, reworked in Venice, and preserved today in the Jewish community in Padua, a city nearby Venice. So here what we see that is interesting is we see first the description of the top. This is the gateway to the Lord, the righteous shall enter through it. This is from Psalm 118, and is a typical Psalm quotation that we find in this repurposed parochot. In addition, here what we see, the original Muslim niche, the mihrab, that is usually in Muslim carpets, prayer rugs, the mosque niche orienting prayer toward the Mecca. We see a sort of combination of motifs. There is the gateway with a Renaissance perspective that combines the iconography of both the typical mihrab and the frontispiece of Hebrew books published at the time in Venice in large numbers. And the frontispiece is the access to the book, just as the door is the access to the home. And here the menorah and the Keter Torah and the braziers that actually comes from Ottoman, from a popular motif in classical Ottoman Turkish art. I'm publishing these images, so I want to show you more this one, the one that is still unpublished. This second parochot was realized by Tovali Cohen Tamari and dedicated to her father, the physician Joseph Cohen Roffet, as indicated by her inscription and signature. In an act of domestic transculturation, Tova repurposed a pre-existing Muslim prayer carpet from Kashan, closely resembling the presentation carpet preserved in the Procuratoria di San Marco in Venice, as a parochet, restoring its spiritual function while reframing it within Jewish rituals practice and family affections. Its scales appropriate for a synagogue rather than a private home aligns with practices in which women asserted their presence in the community through visible donations from the domestic sphere to the synagogue, marked by their signature and dedications. To conclude, during the 16th and 17th century, Venetian Jews created a new kind of culture in their cramped apartments, composed of an eclectic microcosm of architectural elements and production of objects with a Mediterranean diffusion, different patterns of consumption, and an amalgamation of taste, emotions, and meanings. Ultimately, Jewish identities in early modern Venice were a product of roots of the past and roots of the present. Unstable lives and both traveling and fixed objects and architectural elements. In such a societal, cultural, and political context, Jewish women emerged as especially invested in the home and its objects. The Jewish home was the centripetal and centrifugal center of those transformations. Unique phenomena of adaptation, cross-culturation, and transculturation could exist and coexist only in the narrow and volatile spaces of the Venetian ghetto apartments. Thank you.
So that was really wonderful. Thank you so much. I'll be happy to sort of moderate the discussion and take any questions from the floor. Perhaps I can begin by offering a couple of considerations, and I have two questions. So the first thing that I want to say is that I'm really struck by this incredibly, almost magical new world that you're opening up in the ghetto, right? So, we know the ghetto from the outside, as it were, but then you sort of like open the key and you take us inside, and inside we see this world that is much more complex than we could possibly have imagined, sort of this multi-layered social, religious, cultural identities that show up from the inside. It's almost like one of those Russian dolls where what you see doesn't look like much, it contains worlds within worlds within worlds. And I think that that's really sort of novel and really kind of methodologically beautiful, and you gave me a lot of ideas. The fact that you're doing that through objects is particularly, I find, fascinating, right? So you open this door, and what you see is not necessarily just people, but also things. And those things have a life on their own, right? Both with the corridoro, and then in the end of your talk with a tablecloth, those objects themselves contain multitudes, as it were. So an object is never an object. It's always reappropriated, negotiated. And so again, this game of Russian doll continues, even at the level of the object. And that seems to me, again, not just sort of opening up new avenues for research on this subject, but also methodologically and incredibly interesting suggestions for people who work on different things. Just take the object seriously and take them as multi-layered entities rather than solids, as it were. So those two things I'm thinking a lot about, and I will be thinking about for a while. As to my questions, I have two. One thing that you said that I thought was also incredibly perceptive is when you said that the homes in the ghetto were open vertically and horizontally, right? So this idea that unlike Christian households, in which the world happened on the inside, there is a world inside the home and there is a world outside of the home. These Jewish homes open themselves up to the outside. And the portego, in a way, that's sort of an architectural shape of that move toward opening. But my question is, what about women? In the sense that, do women open their home in the same way? So you mentioned the successful attempts of women to intervene, to leave their mark by leaving certain objects to the synagogue or to dispose of their objects as their property as a way to manage their kind of public identity, not just the private ones. But I wonder, can you say more about what kind of margins did they have for sociability? Those widows, did they open their rooms to anybody? Did they find another way to kind of open their homes horizontally to the people? And so that's one question. The second question has to do with objects. And that is to say, so you mentioned both ephemera, like linen, those kind of things, and then objects that are more permanent, furniture or things that you pass. Do you, in this new book, make a big deal of their difference? Is there a life of ephemeral, like those linens? Are they treated like not ephemeral? Does it matter that they are of different substance? These are sort of the things. I don't want to take too much space, and I'm really looking forward to the book now. Just like I want to read it now.
Oh, you will read it. I will send to you.
Please do. I will hold
before
it.
Publication.
Oh, I will hold it to you. I'll be delighted and honored.
And Stefania, thank you so much for your comments and for your questions that actually will stay with me for 4 days. So, are really, really good questions. So let me start actually with the second one, and the objects and the ephemeral. So what I think is here interesting is that because I mentioned matrons, but I also have connected to objects and the way that Jewish women had to express their identity and their way also to look. When I mentioned the idea of from the Jewish home having a nexus that open wider to Mediterranean and the rest of the world. So the ephemeral that is not totally always ephemeral in the early modern world, in the sense that even a shirt or of linen, is always valuable. 3 days of work, for example, for a carpenter. So what happens here that I found very interesting is that looking at Jewish servants or actually former enslaved Jewish women who later got manumitted by their Jewish householders, is this way also to have through donations of their ephemeral objects, like for example, have this Sephardic Jewish woman come to my mind now, and her name is Grazia, and she lives in Venice, and she sent through her testament a blanket to a mestiza in Jerusalem, another a blanket to Constantinople, to another female friend. So this idea of sending objects that are not precious like corridor, etc., but is an act of not only expressing an agency in a way, if we can use at least a stance in determining their own property, but it's also a sense of seeing the geography. Venice is here, Jerusalem is here, and in the middle there are other cities. So that is one thing that comes to my mind in terms of what I found in this kind of acts of donation is also a way to communicate friendship for which Jewish women and women in the early modern period didn't necessarily have a language. Mm-hmm. So it's interesting when these Jewish maidservants, for example, and I found a group of them, childless, elderly, living with their Jewish householders, when they needed to communicate, for example, in their testament, affection to their householders, they think of them as a surrogate family, and they have a vocabulary. I live to my Oro, he's like a daughter to me. But on the other side, when they send to friends, it's just sending. There is not a vocabulary, because actually also in Jewish culture, there is not a proper model of female Jewish friendship that actually there is for male friendship. Regarding the women and the identity, right? In a way, going in terms of opening their houses. So there is a famous example of Sara Copio Sullam, who was a daughter of an Italian Jewish merchant and the wife of a Sephardic merchant who opened a salon littéraire in Venice. She was successful for a while. She was inviting Christian intellectuals, and she was successful until 1621, when basically she refused to convert to Christianity, and then she was attacked by all these supposedly intellectual companions. So there is this thing, and that is also significant because she was not the only woman attacked in Venice for emerging as an author. There was also other Christian women, and all of them, they were not fulfilling the model of the modest matron. And she was Jewish, by the way, or the another was a nun. So there was this circle. But here is also the fact of the fact also is interesting that she had the opportunity to respond publicly to a public accusation, publishing her manifesto through a Christian printing house. So Venice is quite complex. What in this sense? What I will see that, for example, a phenomenon that in my opinion is clear in terms of publishing emerging for women and their houses is, for example, competing with Jewish men. Jewish men were giving they were giving men to confraternities have wrought for dowering Jewish brides. And none of these confraternities admitted women. So these matrons, what they're doing, you know what, I'm doing my own network, and they were starting donating their own money through the donation or when they were alive or when in testaments to Jewish women they chose. And that is a broad network that goes to Amsterdam, to Morocco, to Algeria. Is quite interesting. This, and also the fact itself that these Jewish women were going constantly to notaries. This Letizia Lamias, for example, who is, and thank you, Stefania, because you are absolutely right, it's so complex and layered. These, in any case, women are weaker socially in the ghetto. So this Letizia Lamias, just the woman I presented at the beginning, what she does, her husband converted to Christianity. So she used the system of the Venetian magistrates, having her husband declared dead. So you converted to Christianity, you are dead to me. And you are dead also to the magistrate in Venice, who agreed with her. And she get her dowry. At the same time, though, the husband, Christian husband, refused to give her the get, the Jewish divorce. And what was his position was, oh, I'm Christian now. I cannot even going back to Judaism for 5 minutes to give you the divorce. So that is, in a way, you know, she was active, she got what she wanted, and at the same time, she was not capable to remarry again. She remained in a guna. That is a category that is really problematic in Judaism. Thank you.
Thank you. If I can follow up, and then I promise I will get back to you. When the story about the dowry, so I saw a similar case but from the Inquisition stuff, but in that case, the Inquisitor tried to intercede to block the procedure and have the magistrates not certify the death of the guy.
Okay, that
Do
is
you see a lot of those things? Or
so,
is this my...
yes, and what happens is at a certain point, these legal proceedings that these Letizia Lamias produced were very important for the Jewish community. So what they do, they publish them in a pamphlet where there is a list of cases, and this is the first, say, how you can deal with a husband or a wife who converted to Christianity. Absolutely. Exactly. So this is what you should claim. Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, sorry.
These beautiful rugs, were they custom made with the Hebrew letters, or they were just bought?
Or they were just
Bought
They were custom made and ordered?
or bought in the store.
Oh, no. Thank you for your question. Also, thank you. So that is my other points. Thank you so much. Because actually these were embroidered by these women. And my point on this kind of parochot is this kind of idea that I present in the book. So please tell me if I'm completely wrong. So I think that we have women like this Rosa Luzzato. She was fluent in Italian, Yiddish. Her sister was copying books. They were also writing testaments in Italian for other women. But I think that what is interesting about these parochot that are written and embroidered actually in perfect Hebrew, and we know that they were the women who were also preparing the shape for the letters. In my opinion here, what we can consider is also an alternative way of writing and learning and literacy in a way. Because actually a lot of women that I found in the archives, they were much more secure in writing on this parochot than embroidering Hebrew than writing in Italian on paper. So that is absolutely, thank you for bringing the topic, the question, because these were all made by the Jewish women who put the signature on this parochot. Thank you.
Yes?
You were talking about the differences inside the Jewish homes of what you might find ritual objects. If you looked at an unfurnished apartment made for a Jewish family or a non-Jewish of the same socioeconomic, would you be able to tell by any architectural features, this is for this and this is for that?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for, it's an excellent question. Thank you so much. So what I think is here, also when you see the portego, this all, in a way you see how the spaces of the ghettos were much more, were really cramped, and were also, there was a scarcity of houses and also a scarcity of possibility to build. So an element that already scholars like Ben Ravid or Denakat had emphasized is that Jews, for example, only in the ghetto were developing in high like nobody else. So there is, you see, the apartments that are much smaller, they are basically, there are a lot of entrance and superimposition of a room after a room, and then they develop for floors in high. That is one element. A second element that is true that at a certain point in houses, in Christian houses, they were divided. But if we can really look at the history of the spaces, Jews in 16th century were basically the only ones who were living in apartments. All the other Venetians, even poor, the majority of them were living in houses. And what is interesting in looking at, you walk in Venice, you see the buildings of the ghetto that were developing on high, and the fact is that think about it, this space was in where Jews were confined because actually the idea was taking out of the sight of the view these polluters. Jews were considered polluting the Christian body of the society. So you confine them in this ghetto, thinking it's walled, you don't see them. But what happens is that actually they were seeing everything because they were high. They were even watching at nuns, what they were doing, and the magistrates were complaining about. So yeah, absolutely, there is difference, and thank you for your remark. Thank you.
Thank you. Go him, and then.
Thank you so much for this talk. This was really spectacular. My question is fairly broad, just because I'm curious to hear more, but I'm thinking about other studies that have looked at architectural dialogues around the Mediterranean. I'm thinking, for instance, about studies of like domed architecture in Istanbul, and I'm just curious how, or rather, like what insights you draw about the Mediterranean and the Mediterranean world from this other vantage point.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. So I would say that Venice, and so if we think about Venice and Constantinople, they have a lot in common, and this altane, this is something that actually Venetian borrowed from the architecture of Constantinople. What I see in the ghetto houses is a sort of replica of this kind of terraces, pergolati, iron windows that you see in Constantinople, and you see also in Venetian houses. What I would say that here is particularly interesting is that you see how Jewish merchants from the Ottoman Empire, as soon as they got stable in the ghetto, what they ask is immediately getting a license for an altana, for this terrace. So I don't know if I can speculate, thinking, okay, they were coming from a house that probably had this altane, and they want to absolutely to have them in their apartments as well. Thank you.
Yes.
Speaking of Christian conversion, was only to Catholic branch of Christianity or other Christians?
You mean in Venice in general?
Right.
So there were also, Venice was a cosmopolitan city, and actually Stefania knows much more than I do, but on the different movements. What is, I would say that was interesting here, there are also a presence of Greek Orthodox and merchants, that they have also their own neighborhoods, and often Greek Orthodox merchants, actually they ask the Venetian government to give them the charters, similar charters as Jews had. And then there were also so-called Lutherans, Protestant merchants also, and who were admitted in Venice. Basically, think about a mercantilistic city. That is an important element. But the predominant were Catholic. There were also a group of what I called, for example, in Modena, when I was working on this city in the 17th century, Christian heterodox, that were basically Christian Catholics, were flirting with the Reformation. And Stefania is a master on the topic. Please.
Years ago, we visited the synagogue on Shabbat in Venice, and I was struck by the size and the number of hanging lamps, chandeliers. You showed sort of like a woodcut of Shabbat in a home, and there was a hanging lamp or chandelier. Now, I assume that was reflecting the years of the 16th, 17th century. So, and I know that Venice was a center of glassmaking, but what was the nature of the chandelier? And was it specific to Venice, that it would also be prominent in the Jewish worship house? Was it just glass that would reflect the sun? Excuse me. Any details?
Okay. So thank you for example, thank you also for bringing the concept of class here, because what I would say is that the etchings I show are, on the one, you need also to work with images, and in a way they think about, we are sometimes used to only the archival sources tell us the truth, actually also the images. The problem is that you put the archival sources and the images, the objects in dialogue. So what I would say here is that so that kind of lamp that you see in the etching. So there are, if you look at illuminated manuscripts produced in Italy, and not only in Italy, but by Italo and Ashkenazic, commissioned by Italo and Ashkenazi family, you see this kind of shape of the Shabbat candle quite often. Also, in the archival sources I found, and there are also some objects in museums that are a couple that are still extant. The problem is that these objects are delicate and they get broken often. But then I also found a description of this shape of lamps in Venice in some inventories, not only for synagogues but also for apartments, like the ones that we saw here. I would say that the lamps that you saw in Venice in the synagogues, many of them are from late 18th century on. There is the Ner Tamid, for example, in front of the Torah arc curtain, that usually in these synagogues, I remember the Spanish and Levantine, are from the end of the 18th century, early 19th century.
Thank you.
Yes, I have a question. You have shown us portraits of male individuals. Is there any portrait preserved of a woman, either big or a small one? I don't know if they were doing like the very small ones that were circulating also during the time. My other question is, I would like to know more about the structure of the book, because I've seen so many possibilities from like talking about a woman or talking like Stefania talked about that a bit, like the part of the house. You open a house and then you have different parts and you have this object, this other object. It could be an incredible story. So what are your thoughts?
So Martha, you said the second question was the structure of the home?
No, your book.
Of the book.
Of the book.
Your book.
Yours. Okay. My book. Okay.
We're so curious. We won't let you feel. We want a preview.
Okay. Regarding the women portraits, so first, it's not exactly a common practice among Jews having this kind of portraits. So this kind of a small portrait that we can find in the Christian world is not that common in the Jewish world. There are also elements of the Jewish law, the representation of the human figure, that in any case played a role here. And actually one of my points is also that I have that these all these in Cuori d'Oro, all of these elements in a way challenged a little bit this idea of aniconism in the Jewish home or even in the synagogue. So what we have is, so far I didn't find any extant women portrait. I know that Sarah Hopiusullam had a portrait. There is a portrait that is that has been attributed to an artist in Venice. It could be her, but then art historian thought that perhaps it's just a copy. That is one element. Regarding there is a medal of Gracia Mendes that was circulated, but she was an outstanding figure in mercantile elite, and but related to Venice. And the structure of the book. So what I have is, what I consider the book is thinking about 4 chapters, and in these 4 chapters, there is one chapter that is actually, that is what I wanted to present, because this should be the first chapter. A sort of building on the Jewish home as a microcosm for communities, individuals, and objects. Then I have another chapter that, you know, when you're writing a book or you think about writing, there is a chapter where you put everything that is not in the other chapter. So that is a sort of chapter where I'm looking at what was happening in the Jewish home, and I look also at different relations, a form of friendship, forms of seduction of Jewish women in the house, for example, and men. For example, an interesting element here is that sometimes there were. I always tell my students, Jews really like having sex and having good food, so and everybody is awake in the classroom. And this thing of sex in the home is important and is a part of intimacy and the dark also of the Jewish home. So these things happened. There were relations between householders and non-married Jewish women. And sometimes these also were women of color. What happens here and here I have a rabbinical literature. What happens here that instead of other contexts in which you see the women seduced, kicked out of the home, here we have the women who actually marry their householder, and sometimes, if not Jewish, they convert to Judaism. So there is this also this part that I'm really interested in understanding what is going on in the Jewish home, also in terms of relations, and also the fact that the Jewish home has a space where clients mixed. So I found a lot of sources on Jewish home that actually, on Jewish women in the home and Jewish men were hosting Christian clients and Muslim clients, or sometimes they were going to their Jewish homes as well. And then another thing that's interesting for me is look exactly what was also going on with new Christians, families, who were outside of the ghetto in what I call a buffer zone near Canareggio, who were constantly in contact with their Jewish relatives in terms of relationship. Then I want to work on the concept of friendship and relationship with between matrons and Jewish maidservant or Muslim servants, and looking exactly how these forms of donation, friendship, circulation of objects developed, and also how there were these networks of Jewish women who were in Skopje, in Constantine, in Malta, who were in the Netherlands, were all applying to these funds of these Jewish dowry society that were actually open to all Jewish women of Sephardic origins. This is really a cosmopolitan global Jewish confraternity, and I trace their lives from a house, from a place to another place, looking at the relationship with their matrons and between among themselves. Then I go to the chapter where actually I developed the idea of female literacy and alternative forms of female literacy, considering particularly this parochot and also the way women had to write and to copy books and Hebrew manuscripts instead of regular writing, but at the same time also how they were writing testaments for themselves or for others. This is more or less the structure. Thank you.
I'm going to abuse my power to ask one last question, which is archives. So you have testaments, and then, because it must be like a treasure hunt. Oh, I'm so sorry. Yeah. No, my question was about archives, right? Because I think searching for these things is like the treasure hunt. So you've got testaments, and what else? How do you go even about sort of finding archival sources?
So what I have is the following. A correspondence between the community and the Venetian authorities. So for example, we're talking about the expansion, the horizontal expansion of the Jewish apartments. What happened in this correspondence is that Jewish merchants or rags dealers, second-hand dealers, they ask at a certain point if they can exhibit their textiles on the quays, on the river, outside of the ghetto. So that is an expansion, for example. So all the correspondence with the civic authorities, and there were three different magistracies that were appointed to deal with the relationship, about the relation between the city and the Jews. Then there is a plethora of fondi, of collection, where there are the inventories. And you can find inventories for different reasons. There is an inventory if you had an issue with one of their relatives who died. There are inventories that are for fights with relatives for not marriage purposes. So there are 3-4 fondi of inventories, and then you go there hoping to find the right fondi. Then there are notaries, and what is interesting here about, some of you asked me differences between Jews and Christians. Here what is really also in common that Jews and Christians and Muslims in Venice as well have is that the notaries, the notarial culture permeated the life of the Venetians, meaning that for anything, the Jews were and also Jewish women were going to the notary, not only for testaments, but for example for dowries or for selling or renting an apartment. So that is the mare magnum of. Then there is the Inquisition, that is extremely interesting. There is the Opera Pia dei Catechumens, the Catechumens confraternity that is in another archive, not in the Archivio di Stato. Then you have manuscript written in Hebrew, and you have also collection from different confraternities that are scattered from Venice, Jerusalem, New York, Cincinnati, that are collection in different languages of Pinkassim, registers of different Jewish confraternities, and what else? Wow. Another interesting aspect, I really like these women. I don't know how all these women pop up. So one, for example, is a woman who is a Sephardic woman. She lives in contemporary Turkey, in Constantinople, and she becomes the advisor of the wife or the wife or the concubine of the Sultan in Constantinople. And she writes in Ladino to the Venetians, sometimes that is my language, and she writes also in Hebrew, she writes also in Italian. So this also the correspondence from Constantinople is interesting. And there is a series of these kiras that have been also studied a little bit in the past, but their way to basically interject in the diplomacy using objects is also interesting. Thank you, Stefania.
No, thank you. This is fascinating. So I think let's thank our speaker. There are still refreshments, so we can sort of, if we have any question or sort of comments, we can kind of intermingle. Thank you again. This was really fascinating, and thank you all for attending.
Thank you, Stefania. Thank you all for being here. Thank you.